So we looked at wisdom as a skill, and it's not just somebody who's got lots of knowledge and experience, but it is the skill of living righteously. And living righteously, especially in the context of God's creation that is broken. We cannot reduce life to algorithms that is simply, do this and you're going to get this output. All the right inputs guarantee the right outputs. Life is not like that. There's not a code to be broken that if we can just figure out, instead of AI, have SI, spiritual intelligence, and do all the right things, then we're going to get all the right blessings. This is the reality of seeking to be a person who honors God, who loves Him, who is committed to the relationship with Him in a context and environment that's broken and saturated by sin, including our own sin nature. When we come to Christ, we are not immediately cleansed from the ongoing, lingering effects of sin. We continue to wrestle with that. Paul made it clear in Romans 7, the things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do. And he called himself wretched because of this ongoing battle. And yet the Spirit of God is greater than that, and the process of transformation continues. And Peter encouraged his early followers that as he shepherded that church he wrote his epistles to continue to grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. So wisdom is part of understanding the reality that God has created, but not from the Apostle Paul perspective of doctrine and the behind-the-scenes look into the heart of God and what He has done for our salvation. This is from how do I live since I'm in relationship with the Creator God? How do I live in God's created order that is still contaminated by sin? Now, in Ecclesiastes 3, Solomon uses or presents to us something that might be considered Exhibit A. If you watch courtroom dramas on television, and I have very little experience in court, thankfully, but the lawyers present before the jury or before the judge their various pieces of evidence, and they number them, apparently, if television is accurate. Well, this is Solomon presenting to us in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, Exhibit A on wrestling with, or the skill of living with the frustration of limitation. Because all of us face limits in life. And Exhibit A, he takes something that is a common denominator in all of humanity, and that is our relationship with time. And the first several verses are famous primarily because of a song written in the late 50s by a guy named Peter Seeger, and then became a #1 hit by a group called The Byrds. To Everything, Turn, Turn, Turn is the name of the song. To everything, there is a season, turn, turn, turn. You can Google that if you want to, or go to YouTube and listen to it. Very popular song, still hear it on the radio from time to time. Right out of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And the section we're going to look at comes after that, but we need to understand the context of what Solomon is doing in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 in that first introductory section where he introduces this idea of time. And basically he says, 14 times he says this, there's a time for this and a time for that. There's a time for this and a time for that. There's a time to gather stones, a time to throw stones away. There's a time for embracing, a time to refrain from embracing. He gives 14 examples of there's a time for this and a time for that. And what's his point? He's acknowledging that in God's created order, all of us live in a reality, and this is just an example, Exhibit A, we all live in a reality that we are limited by and we function within a structure called time. And within that structure called time, we have limitations. And we have a perspective. When you are at Disney, you don't have enough time. When you're visiting family and friends, perhaps at a Christmas party, hopefully, you don't have enough time. You want more time to be with them. When you're sitting in the dentist chair, you have too much time. When you're paying off your mortgage, you have too much time. Time creates attention for us that we can all relate to, and it's about our perception because exactly the same number of seconds tick by whether you're in the dentist chair or you're at Disney. So if we can understand the nature of God's created order, then we can answer some fundamental questions about the limitations as represented by the quality of time, because all of us live in time. God created time and space. So whether it's excitement or drudgery, we all face a limitation placed on us because of time. And we wish sometimes we had more time. My grandpa, who is a great source of some of I think they're funny things that I say, he had quite a sense of humor. He used to always say, if I were an hour younger, I'd have bawled when something would go wrong. If I were an hour younger, I'd cry. Because that time, that wisdom, that just because you learn things, it helps you to cope with the reality around you. Well, Solomon is using this concept of time, and he starts out in chapter 3, verse 1, saying, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. In other words, there is somehow in the world that God has created a purpose and a structure and a meaning to all of it, even though it often will not make sense to us. There is a season and there is a time for everything. And then he goes into his 14 examples. So before we look at this in detail, let me read a little bit from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Starting in verse 9, the question is asked by Solomon, after he lists through these 14 things, what gain does the worker have from his toil? It's a theme that's repeated throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, actually. What value is there in our work? And the imagery that Solomon is using goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, when God confronted Adam and Eve for their rebellion against him, for their sinfulness, and he places a curse on what he has created. And in chapter 3, verse 17, God says to Adam, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. In other words, Adam, because you rebelled against me, labor is now going to be difficult, and it's going to be toilsome. It's not going to always be fun. I think if Adam and Eve had not sinned and we were still in the garden, we would have great joy. Going out to do a day's work would be something that would just bring us joy. That's what we were created for. But sin turns that joy into drudgery. And now, even though we try really hard to cultivate our gardens, somehow the weeds grow with greater proficiency than the peppers that we planted. And when Sharon and I were bought our first house, we had a plot of land at the back. It wasn't really big, but we had a little garden. And I'd grown up always having a garden, and my grandparents had gardens. And it was like, we're going to have a garden. We're going to eat fresh carrots. We're going to have fresh peppers. We're going to have fresh everything. And so we got the garden ready, and we planted all this stuff. And then we got busy with stuff and neglected it for a little bit. And one day Sharon said to me, we need to go out and weed that garden. And the enthusiasm of those early days was kind of gone. But nonetheless, we got out there and we decided, and I thought, I am just going to pull every weed in this row. And if you were a weed, look out. I put my head down and I started at the beginning of the row, and it was probably 20, 25 feet long. I got to the end of that row. I turned around, very proud of the work I had done in pulling out all the weeds. And Sharon comes out and she says to me, where are the peppers? Oh, no. Everything went, not just the weeds, but the peppers. I didn't know what a pepper plant looked like. Carrots, I know. Peppers, not so much. This is the drudgery. How is it that those stupid weeds can grow better than the peppers that you can't even tell which is which? Well, this is part of the drudgery of life. And Solomon uses Exhibit A, the reality that we all live in an existence governed by time, and that there is that pressure placed on us, or that external, we can't do anything about it. You can't generate more time. You can't take time away. It's a limitation that we all face. And in our work, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, because of sin, our work then becomes toil. It's repetitive, it's wearisome, it produces little joy, especially when you lived in the era of the ancient Near East, and actually up until maybe just a couple of hundred years ago, where our societies were primarily agrarian societies built on agriculture before the Industrial Revolution and the age of steam and all that. And life was hard, unless you happened to be in that elite, up in the upper level of royalty or whatever. Life was hard and wearisome. It would be nice sometimes, you see these castles in Europe and you think, oh, to live in a castle like that. Yeah, where it's damp and it's cold and there's no internal or no central heating or air conditioning. Who wants to live? I mean, it's a romantic image. Disney's done a great job with that. But really, do you want to live there? No, I'll take my little house that's got central air and central hot water tank and central heat and live much more comfortably. Life becomes toilsome because of the presence of sin. How do we deal with that? And time becomes toilsome because it presses on all of us. Now, this word toil, and it's used a lot in the book of Ecclesiastes, is kind of a fun word. There was a nation or a set of tribes that were opposed to Israel. If you read through Israel's story from the time of the Exodus right through to the time of King David, there's one group of people they're constantly being irritated by. They are constantly going to war against, and they were called the Amalekites. The Amalekites were just irritating, at least from the way the biblical authors tell the story. They were constantly oppressing Israel, constantly giving them nothing but a hard time and trying to come in and to take over and to destroy them as a nation. And the word Amalekite has at its root Amal, which means toil, or to be wearisome, or to be oppressed, to be overwhelmed by grief or anxiety. So it has raised the question, are the Amalekites, is that actually an ethnic name for these people, or is that a nickname that Israel put on these people because every time they came, it ended up in grief and oppression and hardship for Israel? Who knows? But they got labeled with this label of being Amalekites, being a toilsome people, being an annoying group of people. That's the idea of this toil. That what value is there for someone, Solomon says in chapter 3, verse 9, if we work and it is toilsome? Well, time does that to us. Time is Exhibit A of one of the struggles that we have because of the presence of sin in God's created order. So now we're going to come to verses 10 to 17, and Solomon offers a perspective on this toilsomeness. Don't know if that's a word. It is now. Chapter 10 of Ecclesiastes 3. I have seen the business that God has given to the children of men to be busy with. Excuse me. This is going to go back to creation theology now, talking about us being God's image bearers, which he's already kind of made an allusion to by Genesis chapter 3 and referring to the toil of man. I have seen the business God has given the children of men to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. So that's reflecting those first 9 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. It says there is some beauty. There is some order to this. There is hope. Maybe it isn't all toilsome. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive there is nothing better for them to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. I also perceive that they should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor taken away from it. God has done it so that people will fear him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there's a time for every matter and for every work. So notice the theme of time in this final observation by Solomon, that in verse 10, I've seen the busyness God has placed on us. That's the image-bearing role that God has given to us. Verse 11, he's made everything beautiful in its time. He's put eternity into man's heart. These references to time just saturate this entire text because we all live in the realm and the reality of time. And then he wraps up in verses 16 and 17, I saw under the sun, there's that phrase we looked at a couple of weeks ago, that in the place of justice there was wickedness, in the place of righteousness there was wickedness. And I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. So what is Solomon what is the lesson? What is the skill, the wisdom skill? We have to remember that in this style of writing called wisdom literature, it's not like the Apostle Paul wrote, where it was all very logical and laid out according to that articulate mind of the Apostle Paul, where there's idea A and idea B, therefore idea C, and it all rolls in this is very much a logical procession. Part of the genre, part of the style of writing in wisdom is the essays that are put together are intended to reflect a little bit of the confusion that is our daily experience. So we have to unpack a little bit and look for what the themes and the ideas are that Solomon is trying to say, because he's not going to put it in necessarily a logical order, but more of an artistic order. This is more like looking at a painting and interpreting a painting than it is a didactic lesson that we would get from the Apostle Paul. So Solomon's observations then on life, in verse 10 he says, I've perceived. Verse 10, I've seen. Verse 12, I perceive. Verse 14, I perceived. Verse 16, I saw under the sun. Verse 17, I said in my heart. He is perceiving this problem of limitation and trying to figure out, how do I live a righteous life? What is the skill I need to live so I can live righteously when these limitations are placed on us? Exhibit A, time. But not just time. He now talks about righteousness and wickedness, and just when life is overwhelming, what is the skill that I need? Well, verse 10 addresses the frustration of being an image bearer, that God has created us in His image. This is creation theology, and yet that responsibility, because of sin, is now overwhelming. We are not capable of fully completing the function for which we were created. And because we cannot do that, life has a sense of purposelessness. We are distracted and we try to fill the void with all kinds of things that will give purpose and value and meaning to life, because our allegiance to the Creator is not only broken, but if I can borrow from the Apostle Paul, he said we are enemies with God. So we're repelled. We don't want to go back to the Creator and have the relationship restored. By God's grace, that reconciliation is possible. We celebrated that at the Lord's table here this morning. But this tension, even after we are part of the community of faith, after we've been reconciled to God, there is still this tension that the burden that God has placed on us, living righteous lives in an unrighteous environment, is overwhelming. In verse 11, though, there's just this glimmer of hope, because he says, even though the world is broken, He has made everything beautiful in its time, or it still has value and purpose. And He has put eternity into man's heart. And here's one of the great phrases from Ecclesiastes that you see quoted in many different places, and yet the scholars have great debates about exactly what this phrase means. I think there are three potential ideas, and if you've been writing out in your journals, you will see that the New English translation that is in the journals translates this as the word ignorance. I don't think that's capturing the full idea here. The other idea is that it could just be translated as time. He's put in an understanding of time in our hearts, and I don't think that's what it is either. I think in light of the larger context, what Solomon is saying is that we have an awareness. God has created us with an awareness that this reality is not all that there is. That there is something greater than ourselves out there that we are missing, and that something is the only thing that can satisfy that inner longing of our heart. And that's why Solomon has said, I've gone out and I tried everything. I tried pleasure, I tried wisdom, I tried all kinds of things to satisfy this inner longing of my heart, and none of it satisfied. But he comes to chapter 3 and he says, I now understand God has placed eternity and awareness of something bigger than time in my heart. And because it's bigger than me, I cannot understand it. I cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know it's out there, and the only thing that makes sense is to be aware that it is out there, namely God, but I can't fully understand it. So I have two options. I can try to understand what that is as God has revealed himself to us through creation and through Scripture and through the person of Christ. I can try to figure out that eternity thing. We have the advantage of the New Testament that Solomon didn't have. Or I can live in frustration and try everything else, and nothing is going to satisfy because only God can feel that sense of eternity. And I think Solomon chooses this word eternity because he's using as Exhibit A the frustrations, the limitations of living in a world governed by time. And none of us can escape that. All of us have that exact same limitation of time on us. So how do we perceive and understand then the futility in which we live? Well, it would be great if we could understand God's purposes from beginning to end, but God has chosen to not tell us all those details. I wish someday, well, first of all, I wish that I would have the opportunity to sit down with God just for 15 minutes, sit down with Jesus, say, okay, I've got some questions. Can you just clarify a few things for me? Because if I could have these questions answered, these other things would make sense, and I'd be good for the rest of my life. Well, I don't think that's true. I think every question would add to more questions to more questions. This is the essence of faith, right? Understanding that we live this life, trusting that God's in control, even though I don't understand it all. And then I think, wouldn't it be great if in eternity, someday in eternity, when I'm in God's presence, you know, the new heaven, new earth, or after I die and I go to heaven, or whatever all that stuff looks like, and I can take Jesus aside and say, now I would like for you to clarify for me a few things that happened in my experience. Because I had this tragic experience and I was confused by this and I was disappointed in this. Would you please explain to me your purposes? But you know what? I don't think that's going to happen either. Because I think in the moment that we see him face to face, we will instantly be satisfied by his goodness. And we won't ask him to explain himself. It's not going to be the people's court. Jesus, you're on trial. Okay, Exhibit A. Remember this when this happened to me? Did you see how much that hurt me? Would you mind kindly, sir, explaining? No, it's going to be, wow, you're God, and I am not. I bow down and worship you. That's what it's going to be. And as much as I'd love to have 15 minutes with Jesus right now, that would be totally contrary to the concept of what it means to live by faith. So Solomon says, in this reality of time, where there's time for this and time for that, and it may not make sense, and we got this toilsome burden that God has placed on us because we're created in his image, there still exists a sense of eternity, that there is still a creator God out there, and we sense him, we long for him, but we can only find him as he does that work within us. And part of the reality of living with limitation and frustration is remembering that God has intentionally decided that we would not know the beginning from the end because it's beyond our ability to comprehend. And these are things that only God himself can know. So in spite of this, he says in verses 12 to 14, there are some things that are true. Verse 12 says, I perceive there is nothing better than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. I also perceive that we should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. First, even though the world is toilsome and there are things we don't understand and we have limitations placed upon us, the goodness of God can still be seen and experienced. That doesn't necessarily mean that God's going to make everything rosy and lollipops and unicorns. And when you become a Christian, you have no more problems. It does mean that in the midst of the frustration of limitation, we can still see the goodness of God because life is lived in His presence. And this is a fundamental truth that I think in our modern Christianity, we are so consumed with doctrinal orthodoxy in getting our doctrinal statements, 10 points of doctrinal statements in systematic theology nailed down and defining who we are, that we have forgotten the reality that we live in a world created by God, our Father's world, and in this created order is still in His presence, and He is still engaged, and the goodness of God can still be seen and experienced and enjoyed even by those who do not know God, the common grace of God. But for those who have been reconciled to Him, we do know that He continues in spite of the toilsomeness, in spite of the limitations and the overwhelming nature of life in general, that God is good. And he goes on, he says, this is God's gift to man, that we should eat, drink, and take pleasure. He is not suggesting hedonism here. Go out and have a good time, get drunk every night because there's nothing else to live for. No, it's because you can eat, because you can drink, because of this, you can take pleasure in what God has given to you in your toil. It's a gift from God to enjoy His blessings. Verse 14, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it or anything taken away from it. God has done it so that people will fear Him. So his second idea is that when we have a limitation and the frustration of limitation, it's a reminder of our dependence upon God. And this is not just a psychological trick or crutch that we lean on, but this is a change in our perspective that since we live in God's created order, and this is our Father's world, we can have confidence that God has purpose to every detail, and we can depend on His faithfulness even though we are confused and overwhelmed and it doesn't make sense. And the hurt is so deep that our hearts are going to break and we have no more tears to shed. We still know that God is good. And all that He does is goodness. So Solomon says, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. My labor may be toilsome, but the labor of God is not. And part of the labor of God is to care for His creation so that we would fear Him. Then he goes back to this time element. He ties this together with that first part of Ecclesiastes 3 in verse 15. That which is already has been. Okay, there's a time element. Whatever's been in the past, or in the present, it's already been in the past. That which is to be, the future, it's already happened. Why? Because while time is a limiting nature, we can't time travel. We all struggle to live in the oppression that time can place upon us. It's already known by God. It's already been seen by God, and God seeks what has been driven away. In other words, no matter what we can do, God is aware of it. And I saw under the sun, and that's an important phrase. Remember what that means? That means if my perspective is purely the natural world without any accommodation or thought for God and His sovereign hand in creation, I saw under the sun, in the place of justice, there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, there was wickedness. I saw corruption. And this is a frustrating limitation. And it will not surprise you to know that corruption exists in the world today. I suspect there is corruption in our politicians, some of them, not all of them. But I suspect there may be some. When Sharon and I moved to Ecuador, we shipped all of our goods and we landed up in customs down there, and we ran into a customs agent who required a $10,000 fee to release our stuff for us. And we battled that for 19 months until finally the insurance company got us out. It's a long story. I'd love to tell it sometime, but there's corruption in the world. And if we have an under the sun perspective, we can be overwhelmed by that as a limitation, that it's not fair, it's not right, it's not just, and you're absolutely correct. But that doesn't mean there's not hope. Because God is on His throne. That's part of the message of Ecclesiastes. What does he say then in verse 17? Even though I see these things under the sun, I said in my heart, God will judge the nations and the righteous and the wicked. And he goes back to this phrase from the first part of the chapter, there is a time for every matter and for every work. God is not limited. Exhibit A is time, because we live in this linear process called time. And within that, it places limitations on us. We get frustrated with those limitations sometimes, but those are all part of the reality of God's created order and always have a purpose, even though they frustrate us. God is the source of all resource. We recognize that. All good things come from his hand. Well, guess what? He's also the source of limitation. And the Apostle Paul tried many times to go to Rome to preach the gospel. And twice, it says, the Spirit of Jesus prevented him from going. He faced a limitation. And Solomon, he looks around and he says, if all I see is life under the sun, from a physical, without God included kind of perspective, then, I am faced with limitations and it's frustrating. There's a time to throw away and a time to gather, but how do I know which is which? What wisdom skill is Solomon trying to teach his audience of young men who will become the civil servants, working in the royal court, faced with all kinds of temptations of money, power, influence? With power and influence comes all kinds of extra responsibility. So what is the wisdom skill that Solomon is trying to teach these young men and then, by extension, teaching us? We need to embrace the limitations God places on us so we can live by faith in the unlimited God. Eternity in our hearts is not just the idea that God is out there, but God is out there unlimited and eternal, and we have an awareness of that. And the limitations God places on us, whether it's in time or in the nature of a relationship, living by faith, not in the theological sense like Paul uses it. But when I say living by faith, it's not accomplishing some level of spiritual elitism where we live with perpetual optimism or we have a secret spiritual insight so these things don't matter anymore. In this context, living by faith means we have confidence that the Creator remains engaged in his creation, that we are living, not that God is everywhere, but that we are always living in God's presence. And that the eternity means the unlimited God is still engaged in what he has created. So this is not a technical explanation as Paul would give of sovereignty or predestination. This is referring back to the nature of God's created order, coming right out of Genesis 3. Well, before that God created us in his image. Then Genesis 3, the fact that toilsomeness was introduced into the creation, and yet God remains unchanged above that. And his work, his care over all his creation is ongoing. This is our Father's world. God is the Creator. And limitations that we may face are there for a purpose, because nothing can thwart the hand of God.